Well, welcome to UNESCO MGIEP's podcast series called LearnED. I'm your host, Anantha Duraiappah, Director at UNESCO MGIEP, and curating this podcast series with an attempt to bring to you thought leaders, experts, and critical thinkers to speak on the future of education as we grapple through the challenges of the 21st century and work towards building education systems to cultivate peaceful and sustainable societies. I'm very excited and honored today to be speaking to Professor Daniel Markovits. Professor Markovits is the Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at Yale Law School and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Law. Professor Markovits publishes widely and in a range of disciplines, including law, philosophy, and economics. His writings have appeared in Science, the American Economic Review, the Yale Law Journal, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, also commonly called PNAS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, and the Atlantic. In 2021, Prospect magazine named him to the list of the world's top 50 thinkers. I got to know Professor Markovits when I caught him on a CNN interview with Christiana Amanpour, and on the book on his book called The Meritocracy Trap. Fascinating read. Changed a lot of my perceptions in terms of where the education, and also supported some of my suspicions of the weaknesses of the education system. And when I reached out to Professor Markovits, he immediately replied, to my surprise. I was expecting him to be very busy, but I got within a 24-hour time frame, and he said, I would be delighted to be on your distinguished lecture series. And this is why Professor Markovits is in Delhi after a 1-year hiatus due to the COVID, but we were happy to have him here with us in Delhi, and he will be giving the 10th distinguished lecture in Delhi at the Kamani Auditorium. But today, I have the pleasure of having him on a one-to-one conversation. Welcome, Daniel, if I might.
Thank you, and the pleasure is mine. It's just such a delight to be here.
Thank you. It's great. You were at the tail end of our 10-year celebrations. You were on a panel on transdisciplinary science and evidence, and I think the audience were fascinated with some of your interventions. I got some really positive feedback. So I'm very happy. As an economist, I got a high return on my investment. Daniel, I wanted to talk a little bit about this whole transformation in education. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Secretary General, the United Nations, he had this Transforming Education Summit in New York at the last General Assembly meeting. And he highlighted that we have an educational crisis. He talked about how we need to rethink about education. He called it for a rebooting of our education systems. And he laid out a vision, but we had this vision for many years. In fact, since 1948, when we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26 talks about education as a human right, personalized education, when they talked about developing the personality of every learner. What would be your would you sort of say deja vu, or like we have heard this? What is it going to be different? What would you recommend based on on what you wrote in The Meritocracy Trap, as well as your new upcoming book on what change is needed?
I think there are two dimensions to think about. The first is, what is an education? What should its aims be? What does it mean for a person to be educated? What's the substantive content of education? And the second is distributive. Who gets education? Who gets how much? On the first, I don't think it's necessarily deja vu all over again, but I do think that one thing that's happening, and we saw this actually today in our panel, is that people who are thinking about education are recovering a set of traditions about educating the whole person, about education as making someone more authentically themselves, about education as connecting people to their communities, about education as instruction in wisdom and virtue, rather than simply education as what the Greeks would have called a techne, that is to say, an education in a set of skills that are marketable. And I think that that form of education, which in the US is most closely associated with the American pragmatists, with John Dewey, but which has traditions in the sort of European intellectual history that go all the way back to Aristotle, and has other traditions, intellectual histories in other parts of the world. That, I think, was not quite lost, but neglected for a period when education became about producing marketable skills. And I think there's a recovery of that tradition. On the distributive side, I think there's an increasing recognition that education, first of all, needs to be fairly distributed, but second of all, that because education is positional good, because the value of my education is dependent on how I relate to other people's educations, the distributive problem is even more pressing. Because when we really educate some people, we harm everybody else.
Right. I want to pick up on the first point, and then I'd like to take up on the harming stuff, because that tends to go much to what we've been talking about, where the education system seems to be one of the best predator training systems in the world. In the face, and I think you very correctly alerted us in a sense that this is not deja vu. Aristotle's time, Socrates' time, as from the Western perspective, but also during the Indian Vedic times and stuff, the whole guru systems where dialogue, discourse, exploratory curiosity, but at that time it was always for the elite.
Right.
And then we made this jump for the masses, but unfortunately we lost the dialogic and we went into this mass education systems that we have, I guess driven by the Industrial Revolution, the need for masses in the factories. So it looks like now we have come back and sort of saying, okay, we need to now go back to the old traditions, but for the masses. So it links up with your distributive aspect as well. Now, UNESCO, in its contribution to the Secretary General's call for transformation, called for a new social contract on education. But you had also mentioned earlier in our panel discussion that social contract is just not, you can't have it just with education, but with other elements of the society. Could you elaborate a little bit for our viewers?
Yeah, sure, on both of these points. So the universalization of education became necessary in significant part, as you say, because the conditions of mass industrial and then mass capitalist production required an educated workforce. They required the workforce to have skills, but they also required the workforce to have its character manipulated in such a way that it would accept the forms of governance that factory production imposed on people. And so both of those things were necessary. At the same time, it became necessary to deliver education in a way that was not so expensive per student, if you're going to educate a lot of people. And dialogic education is incredibly expensive per student. So those two things conspired to make education a form of industrial production itself. There's a sense in which if you have industrial production in the labor force with adult workers, you need industrially to produce adult workers.
That's right.
And so education mimics work in a certain way. And then work is adjusted so that it can operate with the labor force that education has produced. So there's a feedback loop between the two. And that connects to your second question about transdisciplinary approaches, the social contract, education not as a freestanding site of social coordination, but as inextricably embedded in a web of other aspects of the social contract. And there, we need a form of work that matches the form of education that our schools provide. And what that means practically is that if we're going to educate the whole person and educate people to be thoughtful, democratic members of a self-determining society, then work in both its substance and the institutions that houses it also has to be transformed so that workers are not subjugated by surveillance, control, and management, and aren't exploited in doing alienated labor, but rather have to do jobs that can deploy the educations that they have. So if we're going to educate people to be authentically themselves, to be free and equal citizens, they also have to have jobs to go to that citizens of that sort can do and retain their free and equal status.
So, from what you're saying is that I think we have to spend some time when we are so involved in focusing on processes in the education. I think we haven't stepped back to sort of say the purpose of education, but then the purpose of humanity, in a sense. What are our goals? And I think this comes close to what you had written in your first, but also I think maybe alluding to what I've seen from the proclure of your next book, is that material prosperity is not what we are focusing. So when you say the whole person, right, would you sort of consider as human flourishing or flourishing of the person as a goal that, irrespective of culture, context, is something that will cut across all of us as human beings?
Well, certainly all of us as human beings wish to flourish, and that wish is rational and reasonable. It's an appropriate thing for us to want. What flourishing consists in specifically will vary to some degree across cultures. And then there'll be some unifying themes. The material unifying themes are relatively easy to identify. Nutrition, shelter, physical safety, medical care, health care when one is sick. And those are preconditions of flourishing. They're necessary for flourishing. And in a world in which large-scale production is required in order to create enough resources for everybody to have access to those things, that means that education necessarily has to give workers the skills they need to produce the goods that they will need as consumers in order to flourish. But what's necessary isn't sufficient. And other things must be added. And those will vary culturally to some degree, but community, some degree of self-determination, control over the circumstances and conditions of one's labor, participation in collective self-government. Those are the sorts of things that are going to be, as universal as any values are.
Agency
and membership. And non-subordinated membership.
Which, in our panel discussion, if I'm not mistaken, the gentleman from Chile was talking about power. Mm-hmm. And there will be attempts to prevent this from happening because, as you had alluded, in the system that we have, it tends to really sort of gravitate or reduce down to a zero-sum game. And I think the education system's been, and correct me if I'm wrong here, in a sense it propagates that kind of mindsets in terms of the way meritocracy has been pushed as the grand equalizer, which, as in your book says, has done the opposite.
Right. So if you have a competitive economic system in which income, status, and power have to be won by not just producing things that other people value, but outperforming others who try to produce these things. So producing a better good at a lower price, having a larger firm, commanding a bigger market share. If those are the essential features of a work life that's culturally perceived as successful, then education is going to have to adjust, because what the education that people are going to want is going to be one that prepares you, in effect, to become superior to others, rather than simply to do things that are worthwhile. And so competition in the labor market and competition among firms in the real economy will engender competition among students and schools in the education sector. And that's in a way unavoidable, but it can also be quite damaging, because what it does, I think Dewey described it in this way, it transforms education, which should be the empowering activity of giving people access to new opportunities, new engagements, new communities, instead becomes an effort to freeze in place advantage that's already been accumulated. And that has bad distributive effects in the labor market, but it's also bad for education.
How do you break that?
I think you have to break both systems at once. You know, in the labor market, work has to be democratized. An anti-monopoly agenda to break the control of large firms over work is important. Worker empowerment, unionization, political support for workers' interests and rights is important. The restructuring of work and the invention of new technologies that allow large numbers of middle-class, mid-skilled workers to do meaningful and dignified work is important. And all those things have to occur alongside educational reforms that democratize education, that give more people access to education, that make the gap between the best education or the most elite education that society provides and median education smaller, that make elite schools and universities much less exclusive. And those educational reforms then, of course, have to be embraced together with the work reforms I just described. It's an interactive system, and each reform has to support the other.
So where did we go wrong? Because the system that you just described, and I think you mentioned that in your early chapters on the book on meritocracy, is in the 60s. I think it was St. Clair
there's a town outside of Detroit. Yes.
And you had that system. Right. Where unions were strong,
right?
Corporate was controlled. Where did we go wrong? And schools were, in fact, a lot more equitable. Although I think the end was still, I would question that it was not the right end.
It wasn't perfect, but it had certain advantages that our current system doesn't have. Look, I don't know that the right way to think about this actually is where did we go wrong. Rather, it's that there are certain, we as a civilization answered certain imperatives. If you go back 200 years, almost everybody, almost everywhere was trapped in grinding poverty. And if you want a short one-sentence explanation of how we got out of that poverty as a civilization, the leading element of that explanation is going to involve something like widespread investments in education, the expansion, distribution, and improvement of skills and human capital, innovation generated by that human capital, which renders workers more productive, and an explosion of economic growth, which has been the principal driver of the reduction of poverty in the world over the past 100 years or so. And it would be, I think, odd and wrong to view that as a mistake from the start. On the other hand, every system has the vices of its virtues.
Yeah.
And over time, the vices can grow and the virtues can shrink. And elites that succeeded based on this system of openness and competition can entrench themselves and can remake what was once a system that opened up opportunity to outsiders into the technique by which insiders hoard opportunity for themselves, can pay for tutors to have their children take the tests that are admissions exams, can pay for elaborate private schools that out-educate everybody else. And again, that's not because meritocratic educational competition or evidence-based training were bad and wrong in themselves always from the start. It's just that they produced a system which is now reproducing itself.
So would you when we were in the earlier panels and some of the discussions, this whole brain approach in terms of focusing also on the social-emotional dimensions, which most schools, metacognitions, have really not addressed. It was purely on skills, knowledge acquisition, and so forth. When I talk about social-emotional in terms of empathy, understanding the others, would that basically move towards kind of changing that kind of competitive, if I might use the term, predatorial mindset in the long run?
It might, or it might not. That is to say, I think that the problem is thornier than saying that educating the whole person or making people mindful can solve. And let me explain what I mean. If you look at the most elite educational institutions in the world today, they actually do focus on metacognition. They assume that the people that they train will need skills that have not been invented yet. And that if they gave people two particular skills, then their skill sets would be obsolete within 6 months of entering the workforce. So instead what they emphasize is teaching people how to acquire new skills, teaching people how to study, how to learn, how to focus, how to be flexible, how to be creative, how to innovate. And the fact that the elite educational institutions are so good at that produces a great deal of inequality. They also actually teach people how to manage themselves and their lives in the system. So they're not narrow skill producing factories. They try to produce people who can then successfully wield their skills over the course of an entire career. What they don't teach very well is the set of attitudes and capacities you need to run the rest of your life. To be a good partner, to be a good parent, to be a good friend, to embed yourself in your community. Those things they don't teach terribly well, and there are lots of reasons for that. One is there's little financial return in it. But another is across societies and even within a society, we can't actually agree about what the substantive content of those skills is. And so if a school tried to teach them, it would immediately run into partisan political objections, which are very hard for schools to handle.
I hear you on that, because I think there's a huge debate in the United States right now on the introduction of social and emotional, which basically goes into those fields. And many different groups are sort of saying this is not where schools should be involved, this is families and communities, because it is providing a lot of very strong tools for people, isn't it? Daniel, thank you very much. I want to finish off by posing this question, that if you had the opportunity to have dinner with 3 guests related to the discussions that we have had, who would you invite for that?
2 are, I think I know the 3. Partly because I would just love to see a conversation among the 3 of them. Aristotle, Marx, and Dewey. Why each of them? Aristotle, because in his Ethics, which is really a book about moral education, he writes about what it is to have the kind of character that makes your life go well, and how you should cultivate it in yourself, and how others have to treat you in order for it to grow. And one way to think about what education is it's the collective and institutionalized decision a society makes about how it will treat its young people in order that they can grow. And this is something Aristotle had a great deal to say about. Marx, because he is interested in the social, economic, and human face of work, and his ideas about control over the means of production, exploitation, and alienated labor, I think remain today some of the most powerful and precise accounts of how it is that we make things and exploit ourselves and others in the doing of that, and yet might still flourish. But he didn't, in his writings, focus at all on human capital. He lived in a world in which the greatest source of wealth was either land or factories, and the skills of free workers were not essential, but now they are. And it would be fascinating to see how he analyzed a situation in which the highest paid workers and the richest people in society are in fact not capitalists, but a superordinate working class. And Dewey, because unlike Aristotle, Dewey was a Democrat and believed in the equality of all people and universal membership in society and universal agency. And unlike Marx, Dewey believed that imaginative ideas could drive society forward. He was the opposite of a historical materialist. And so for that reason, I think he'd be a great interlocutor for the two of them. But mostly, I think I would sit them down, give them the optimal amount of alcohol, and then recede and listen.
Well, I did sort of say when we were having this discussion on the setting up for this podcast that I'd like to have you face-to-face rather than do these Zooms over a glass of scotch. Unfortunately, we are on a dry day, as they call it in Delhi, because of elections. But I am sure we'll have an opportunity to enjoy that glass of scotch. Thank you very much, Daniel. It was a pleasure to have you and your insights into a very complex, nonlinear, and completely politically charged sector that we are all grappling with. And it's the future of our children, our grandchildren, and it's the future of humanity. Education is one of the most powerful tools that I believe Gandhi, Mandela, and all the others have asserted again and again.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and thanks to everybody for listening. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.